Salutations to the Truth Core, whoever and wherever you may be on the planet. It's April 10th, 2021, and I'm sitting here in what I call the studio corner of my office, looking at a note I've written, which I placed prominently on the computer. And it says, Gnostic Sabotage, 3 talks. So I have the intention to upload 3 talks to my channel under this general theme. Now I know that sometimes I don't follow up from one talk to another. I haven't completed the talk on the parable of the 3 eggs, nor have I uploaded a talk regarding the view that Gnostics take toward worship of supernatural or divine entities. But I do intend to do these 3 talks in sequence. And so here comes the first one. Gnostic Sabotage. Why AI is not the great beast. Now, to frame all 3 of these talks for you, I'll begin by explaining what I mean by Gnostic sabotage. It refers specifically to the book of Revelation, which is the last book of the Judeo-Christian Bible. Now, it's fair to say that just about almost everyone in the world knows, due to the widespread indoctrination of Judeo-Christianity, that the book of Revelation refers to an apocalyptic event. It is a narrative of the apocalypse, an end-of-the-world scenario. And over the last few years, certainly since 9/11, and perhaps even before, there has been an enormous amount of discussion on the internet referring to the apocalypse and how, in some views, in the views of some people, it is actually being fulfilled in our time. So people read the apocalypse as a biblical prophecy that points directly to certain events and situations in our time. I'm fairly sure that many of you are familiar with that topic treated in that way. As a comparative mythologist, I also study the history of religions, which is a specialized genre of scholarship. And it has various subgenres. And one of those is what is called, wait for it, Jewish apocalypticism. That is the study of the apocalypse narrative as it develops through the literature coming from the Semitic languages, and particularly the literature of the ancient Hebrews. So the Old Testament is a document written in Semitic, one of the 3 Semitic languages, Hebrew, Arabic, and Aramaic. And there is a progression, or I should say scholars trace a progression through the Old Testament into the New Testament and then into the apocalypse of the book of Revelation. And that study is called Jewish apocalypticism. And there are about, as I recall, 2 or 3 leading scholars in this field. So I have their books and I've studied them over a good many years. Now, the main claim that these scholars make is that you can come forward from the prophetic books of the Old Testament, such as Ezekiel and Isaiah, and you can extrapolate forward from there and you arrive at the scenario of the apocalypse. So their presumption or conclusion, better said, is that the narrative of the apocalypse in the last book of the Bible is a consistent and coherent derivative of biblical prophecies attributed to the Jewish prophets, Isaiah, Ezekiel, and others. That's their consensus view. You could compare it to the Star Wars franchise. So there are a number of films in Star Wars, and supposedly the plot of those films is continuous. It interweaves from one film to another. So you would expect that the fourth film in the Star Wars series is a reiteration and advancement of themes in the previous three films. That's just exactly how it works. Now I'm going to introduce you to a different interpretation. In my interpretation, when you look at the content of the book of Revelation, you see who the actors are, you see what the conflict is, what is the drama, what is the structure of the plot. Actually, there are elements in it which are not consistent with biblical prophecy. There are elements in it that you cannot derive from, say, the visions of Ezekiel in the Old Testament or the visions of Daniel. So these Old Testament prophets had religious hallucinations, and they saw various demonic forces and various revelations in the heavens. And contrary to the experts in apocalypticism who would tell you that all those elements of biblical prophecy in the Old Testament reappear, reworked in Revelation, I'm saying no. I'm saying that upon close examination, there is something in the book of Revelation that cannot be derived in that way. There is something anomalous and inexplicable in the book of Revelation, in the world-famous, very well-known apocalyptic scenario. And my claim, which I cannot justify in this talk, but I will speak more of it in the two following talks, is that the presence of these anomalous factors is due to an insertion into the narrative by Gnostics. Another example that you might use, an analogy that you might use to grasp what I'm saying here, is the case of a novel. Suppose you're reading a novel, and as you read it, you get a feeling of the style of the author. You see the characters that the author has introduced, and they appear in various situations through the story. And then you have a sense of the plot that the author is developing. This is typical. It happens all the time when you're reading a novel. And in that way, you detect the coherence of the novel. You follow the plot, and you arrive at the conclusion, the moral of the story. But suppose you're reading a novel written by author A, and at some point along the way in the novel, another writer, author B, has interjected scenes and characters. Now, if you're reading the text written by author A carefully and following it well, then you would be able to detect that something odd is happening. Something out of context, something new, novel, surprising, has been introduced into the novel. And if you looked at that closely, you might conclude, and rightly so, that another author had interjected other material into the original material of the first author. This is the case that I make for Gnostic sabotage. The Gnostic sabotage consists of those elements in the book of Revelation that were added by Gnostics. Now, how that happened is another story, and I will occupy one of these 3 talks with explaining how that happened. But for right now, I'm going to go to a key passage, the most well-known passage in the Apocalypse of St. John. And I'm going to look at that passage and decode it, retranslate it, as a way to introduce you to this intriguing notion, really a bizarre notion, that there are things in the book of Revelation that would not be there had there not been for an intervention by Gnostics, who are in fact against Judaism and against Christianity. Now, if I proceed skillfully here and carefully, what I intend to show you, prove to you, at the end of these 3 talks, is that the Gnostic sabotage in the book of Revelation was expressly intended to subvert the message of the book of Revelation. And that being so, if today we can understand what the Gnostics inserted in the scenario of apocalypticism, and as well understand why they did it, then we have an entirely new opportunity to read the apocalypse narrative in an entirely different way. In this talk, I'm going to concentrate on 2 verses. They are the last 2 verses, 17 and 18, of chapter 13 of Revelation. And that no man might buy or sell, except that he had the mark or the name of the beast, or the number of his name. Here is wisdom. Let him that hath understanding count the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man, and his number is 666. Now surely you recognize those 2 verses, and how often are they cited as examples of the prophetic truth of the Bible. Christians rely tremendously on these 2 verses for their interpretation of what is happening in the world today. With the Great Reset, the coronavirus psyop, and track and trace, the marking of the human animal with a genetic serum, which is actually what it is. Moderna has said that their vaccination is not a vaccine as such, considered in conventional terms, conventional medical terms. It is, quote, an operating system, end quote. And many people today are exposing the fact that it is a tool of genetic modification or gene therapy, to use a kind expression. It's actually a eugenic therapy intended to modify the human animal, and it's becoming more and more clear from the evidence that in many cases it's intended to be lethal. So the intentions of this so-called vaccination are to transform the genetics of the human animal or to exterminate, to cull the species. This is widely known. This is widely discussed, and there's a lot of evidence to support that view. I happen to recall the first time that I noticed a surge of discussion and debate regarding this passage was in reference to barcodes. So sometime back, over a decade or so ago, some observers were saying that the barcode on products was the mark of the beast. Well, the situation has advanced rapidly since then, and now it's pretty clear that the barcode is going on the human animal. It's not going on the products that you buy. It's been on those products for a long time. Now it's going on human animals, human beings. So those who have the mark of the beast, 666, have a token or indicator that identifies them. So the authorities track and trace you according to a genetic marker. That is the mark of the beast. Well, obviously, there's a tremendous argument for this case. I'm sure you've heard it many times. And there are variations of it, but primarily it's a consistent argument. Now add to the argument the factor of AI, artificial intelligence, or IT, informational technology. The Great Reset Manifesto declares that they will run society on AI, and they will actually run individuals on AI. So everyone will have an AI marker through injection, and they will have devices that will be able to read that marker, maybe even from satellites in outer space. So they can track and trace everyone by the mark of the beast, and they are using AI. And so you hear the trope that the use of AI in that manner is evidence of the beast system. Have you heard that expression? This is the beast system. The prophecy found in the book of Revelation points today to AI as a control system. And it's reached the point where the mark of the beast will be actually injected into your body and you will carry a genetic marker. Very convincing arguments that go in this direction. But I'm going to bring your attention to something really bizarre that may change your view of that view of the so-called beast system. I invite you to look closely at verse 17. And that no man may buy or sell except that he had the mark or the name of the beast or the number of his name. Now I have a printout here from a reference source I frequently use, which is the Greek-English interlinear of the New Testament. So there you will find the original Greek, which is a dialect of Greek called Koine, which was the vernacular Greek of the time. So it's not a scholarly Greek. It was the spoken Greek of the era. That is the Greek in which the New Testament is written. It's not like the classical Attic Greek of the Greek tragedies 500 or 600 years earlier, nor is it anything like the archaic or Ionic Greek of Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey. Now, this is an important point because everyone knows from the way they use their own language that things spoken in vernacular, in the common language, the common jargon of the street, can have nuances and can have quite different meanings. For instance, when you say that's bad in English vernacular, that can mean something is bad. Like, uh-oh, we've got an appointment. Now we have a flat and no spare. That's bad. This is a bad situation. But you can also say it's bad. And in street jargon, that means something that's cool, tough, radical. So you see, you have to consider that there might be nuances in the vernacular of the book of Revelation. That being said, let's look even closer because it gets better. Let's look closely at the Greek that corresponds to the translation to buy and to sell. Now, obviously, this is a really strong point among those people who regard 666, the mark of the beast, to be manifested and implemented today in the AI tracking system. And you hear talk all the time about the system in China where you have on record in IT files and algorithms, a record of your social behavior. And unless the authorities approve of it, you will not be allowed to buy or sell. And that same principle of prohibition applies, of course, to the COVID PSYOP. If you are not vaccinated, if you do not wear a mask, if you do not go along with the authoritative dictates of the Great Reset, if you are not tested by the fraudulent PCR test, well, you cannot buy or sell. It's happening. It's right here in your face. It's extremely convincing, isn't it? But hold on a minute. Is this translation actually correct? Or could there be another way to translate those words, those two infinitives, to buy and to sell? Well, I submit to you, yes, there is most certainly another way. And it's not something that, what you could say, it's not spurious. In fact, it's very obvious. You don't even have to be an expert in Greek in order to see the other way to translate that passage. I'll take the two infinitives one by one. To buy. This is a translation of a Greek word which transliterates into English like this. A-G-O-R-A-S-A-I. Now, does that mean to buy? No, it doesn't. Note that it has the root word agora in it. And curiously, following the word agora, linked to the word agora, you have A-S-A-I. So AI is in the Greek of the Koine. And the word as is in there as well. So you could translate it, if you really want to get fancy, you could say that it encodes as AI. Curious, isn't it? But principally, the word agora means a place to gather. In ancient Athens, the philosophers gathered in the agora. It's the public commons. And the public commons is not a market necessarily. As a matter of fact, the primary value of the commons is simply to provide a place for the populace to gather and mingle and socialize and discuss things. So the verb, based on the root agora, really means simply to gather and to associate. It does not mean to sell. So what scholars have done by translating it as to sell is that they have added a nuance that may not be correct and is not necessarily correct. They have drawn an implication that the purpose of gathering in the agora, in the commons, is to sell. But of course, that's not true. You go to a market, you go to a store, you sell your goods in a market or store. You may sell your goods in a flea market, but a flea market is not the same as Hyde Park. There is no flea market at Hyde Park in England. It's simply a public commons where people gather. Therefore, I submit replacing to buy with to gather. Now let's look at the second infinitive, to sell. The English transliteration of that word is P-O-L-E-S-A-I. Again, it ends with AI. I think that's just a trifle, but it is curious. And when you look at the way that word is spelled in Revelation, you find that the second letter, O, is an omega. Now, there are two O's in the Greek language. One is an omicron that looks like an O, and the other is the omega that looks like a W, and that is the last letter of the Greek alphabet, which runs from alpha to omega. Now, it's very significant that the spelling in Revelation uses omega and not omicron. Why? Because if you look at modern Greek today and you look up the word to spell, it is Poulo, and it is spelled with an omicron. So the word to sell today is not spelled as that word, which is translated to sell. Now that is a minute detail. But I've been studying this text closely now for about 9 years. It was in December of 2012 when the world was in a big turmoil, or part of the world was in a big turmoil about the Mayan end date, December 21, 2012. Remember that? And it was exactly in that month that I discovered Gnostic sabotage in the book of Revelation. And I've been studying it for 9 years. And I can assure you that this minute detail I'm pointing out to you is, if you'll pardon the allusion, a revelation. So how do I proceed to decode this word, and in doing so, to change the translation and to subvert and redirect the meaning of this passage? Well, I rely on something I've often relied on for a long time, and this is called the PIE, the Proto-Indo-European root. So there are roots that are common to the Indo-European languages. This was discovered by an Englishman, Sir William Jones, around 1800. And it launched the science of philology, which was a key part of the humanities. Philology is the comparative science, comparative study of languages, okay? So when you know, for instance, that Greek and Sanskrit and other Indo-European languages all derive from the same phonemes or roots, you can discover some really fascinating things. The question here is, what is the root behind the Greek word P-O with an omicron, L-E-S-A-I? Well, the root is actually a P-E-L, and it relates to the Sanskrit word panate, which means to barter. Not to buy, to barter or negotiate. And this root shows up in other words in Lithuanian, in Old Norse, and elsewhere. And it is related closely to the Greek word empole, which means to trade, not buy. And that is the root of the word emporium. So generally, if I say, let's go out to the emporium and buy something, well, generally that's correct in vernacular jargon, because an emporium is like a department store that sells many different things. But it's in its original meaning, an emporium was a place that people gathered to barter, not to buy. So I would propose then that the translation of the second word is to trade without currency, or to barter. Now let's add one more slight variation in the translation. Verse 17, and that no man. Well, it doesn't say man. It doesn't use the word andros, which is Greek for man. gyne for woman, nor does it use the word anthropos, which is Greek for human. It just says one. So listen to this. And that no one might gather or trade except to have the mark or the name of the beast or the number of its name. Now that's a prohibition, isn't it? It says that you cannot gather and barter without the mark of the beast. Now you see how different that is from the interpretation I've described already. According to that interpretation, you cannot buy or sell unless you have the AIIT marker issued to you by the authorities. But this is a completely different slant. It says that you cannot gather, associate, and socialize and barter and trade unless you have the mark of the beast. Let that settle in for a moment. Consider that difference. What is it actually saying? Now, I don't want to put words in your mouth, and I don't want to put ideas in your mind. But I think it's fair to say that as you reflect on the contrast between those two translations, this thought might come to your attention. Well, hold on a moment. Gathering and bartering are free activities undertaken by the agreement of those parties. You can gather and barter without money. You can gather as long as you are free to gather. You can barter on whatever terms are agreed upon by the people who are bartering. In other words, that system is free and open and based purely on voluntary agreement. Compare that with the so-called beast system, which is not free and open, and which relies on the approval or permission of the authorities to buy and sell. They're completely different systems. What is happening with the so-called beast system today, and I'll get to that expression in my conclusion in a moment, is that the authorities will not allow anyone to gather, to socialize. Clear? Nor will they allow anyone to buy and sell unless you submit to the system. The alternative is to gather and trade and say fuck you to the system. But how could the possibility of doing that, which some really sane and savvy people are looking at very closely these days, as a way of getting out of this trap, how could the possibility of doing that, to gather freely and trade by agreement, be contained in the book of Revelation? How could it be there? It doesn't fit with the rest of the scenario. Nor does the beast fit with the rest of the scenario, as I will explain in the next two talks. So let me conclude by telling you point blank why the beast, Tomegatherion, the great beast of Revelation, cannot be equated to the AI track and trace financial control system. It's simple, my friends. AI is not alive. AI is not organic. A beast is a living animal. A beast is alive. A lion is a beast, a horse, a walrus, and you as well are a beast. You are an animal. You are not an android. You are not a creature that runs on MS-DOS. You are not a creature whose intelligence operates on AI. You are organic. You are not virtual. The great beast is not virtual. Therefore, it is entirely wrong to use this expression, the beast system, as a prophetic revelation of what is happening today, of the great deceit and the great final endgame of control being imposed upon the world. It is entirely wrong to say that Tomegatherion, the great beast, is an AI IT system. So, what I would like to show you, to my great pleasure, is that the great beast of Revelation is in fact a force to overcome the AI IT nightmare. It is not the fulfillment of that nightmare. It is the very key to overthrowing that nightmare. The great beast is actually on your side if you intend to defeat the Great Reset. That is the takeaway. That is the message coming through Gnostic sabotage in the book of Revelation. Enough said, and I'll be seeing you in the beauty to come.